On this episode of Newt's World, from his earliest beginnings as a dishwasher in a Chinese restaurant to his work in international law and finance, Mitchell Silk's story illustrates how perseverance and divine providence led him to become the first Hasidic Jew ever confirmed by the Senate for a position in the U.S. federal government and a consequential leader in Trump's Treasury. In his new book, A Seat at the Table, an inside account of Trump's global economic revolution, he describes his role as Assistant Secretary in the Treasury, in which he played a senior role in the trade negotiations with China, designed and implemented both the landmark America Crece initiative and the first Trump administration signature program in the Western Hemisphere that spurred infrastructure growth through private capital solutions in Latin America and beyond. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Mitchell Silk. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Maryland Law School. He is fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese and actively engages in pro bono work within the Jewish community. He currently serves as Group General Counsel of Waterton Global Resources and the Cedarfield Group. Mitchell, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for all you've done for our great country.
You know, you've had a remarkable career. Tell me for a couple minutes, just how did you evolve to the person you became?
I'll give you two angles. One of them is my maternal grandfather, somebody who came to this country from Europe in 1920 from a small village in what is now Western Ukraine. In my view, he was the greatest man in the world. I write about him extensively in the book, and he was a person who stood 5'2" in physical stature, but in my view, he was the tallest person in the world. So to frame my first part of my response, I would say that I am where I am because of his great influence on me. But the rest of the story is really one that I can only explain through providence. Some people might call it fluke, but I'm firmly convinced that it's providence, and I see the good hand in every stage of the development of my career. And that career, very interestingly, started out in the kitchen of a Chinese restaurant. I had to go out when I was in my early to mid-ish teens to work to help our family's finances because of our circumstances. I got a job washing dishes and doing prep work in the kitchen. And very interestingly, that job really was a defining point in my whole professional career. That job led to working in the front of the house as a waiter, then went on to formal Chinese studies. I had gotten Cantonese under the belt in the restaurant and then studied Mandarin in college. The Chinese studies in college led me to pursue a career in Chinese law. The Chinese law led me out to Asia to work for a firm that was expanding their energy offering. And so I became an expert in power development and finance. And it was the combination of my expertise in China and infrastructure finance that drew me to the attention of the senior leadership at Treasury and why I was offered a position under Secretary Mnuchin. So that's basically the long and short of it, Mr. Speaker. It all started in the kitchen of a Chinese restaurant.
That's a great story for young people to hear because you don't always know how each step leads to the next step. And so it's important to just take every advantage you can when an opportunity shows up, and your life sort of illustrates that, you know, you could not have planned how your life unfolded, but by working hard and being adaptable, interesting things happened.
Absolutely right. And that's one of the thematic messages, basic messages in the book. I have my little 4 Ps that I talk about: perseverance, progress over perfection, personal touch, and divine providence. And without the hard work, I found that nothing really happens.
We're in a period of extraordinary change right now, and I'd love to get your view because you have been in the room and you know how these things work. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that he thinks they have a framework for a TikTok deal that will allow the app to continue in the U.S. They haven't released what the framework might be, but do you think it's possible to develop a framework that basically guarantees that the Chinese do not have access to the people who are on TikTok and that it does not become essentially a Chinese propaganda system?
There is, Mr. Speaker, and I think you'll be aware that the TikTok case was under heavy review, and there was a tremendous amount of work done on it under Secretary Mnuchin during Trump 45. One of my best buddies in the building, Tommy Fetto, decorated naval officer, was then serving as the first Assistant Secretary for Investment Security. And he and the Secretary, all the way up to POTUS, were heavily focused and actually had come to some solutions that were put forward and in the process of implementation when the administration finished up. Unfortunately, that framework did not move forward. Matters muddled through during the whole of the Biden administration on this issue, as most other issues did. And here we are back in 2025 dealing with the same issue. And to be very specific on the response, there are some very, very, very fundamental requirements or pieces of a framework that we would require in order to ensure that TikTok's continued operation touching on the U.S. would not be harmful to us. We would need to control the algorithm. There'd need to be some element of algorithm control. There'd need to be a way to deal with the risk of data access and flows. And thirdly, of foreign ownership and control paths. And those are really the three fundamental framework hard locks that would be required, along with an enforceable, auditable structure that would ensure that TikTok's continued operation would not be harmful to the U.S. And without that, there's a problem. There's a very big problem. And it's my understanding that the Secretary has spent time on this, Secretary Besson, in Madrid this week, working toward chipping away at an agreement that would ensure these three fundamental pillars, along with an enforceability mechanism.
Since you speak both Mandarin and Cantonese, which I think is a pretty remarkable achievement, as you think about China from your much more intimate perspective than most of us have, what's your whole take on what Xi Jinping's goals are and what we should be thinking about as we look at China?
I spent 30 years of my career, Mr. Speaker, working in China, and the perspective that I had during that time was representing foreign investors and trying to pursue their interest on a rather micro and project basis. And it wasn't until I came to Treasury and inherited the portfolio that I did that I came to appreciate the great challenges with the Chinese approach to growth. When the last administration came into office, we were confronted with a bunch of really big issues. We stepped into a massively large trade deficit. IP theft and weaponized cyber were rampant. Industrial policy was not friendly to us. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, we were seeing the Chinese engaged in some very, very considerable predatory practices, mainly in the kind of developing countries, emerging nations. And none of that is good for the U.S. None of that is good for the world. And a lot of the approach is overt, and a lot of it is, I don't necessarily want to use the word covert, but it's creeping. It's done in a manner that people don't necessarily notice it. And so these development practices and these growth practices are not good, and we need to stop them. And I think that's what the president's agenda on China is all about. It's to not be complacent and to confront the issues. And that's what we saw as a key driver and an underpinning of our negotiations during Trump 45. And I expect that that is the thrust of the formulation of our negotiating positions during Trump 47.
From the standpoint of an everyday American, how big a deal is trying to work out an agreement with China? And in your judgment, is it likely that we can get a deal that is truly acceptable to the U.S. accepted by a totalitarian dictatorship?
I think it is, sir. We certainly did deliver a deal that was good during Trump 45 that unfortunately was disrupted by the impact of COVID and failure to continue to push on the agreement that we had settled during the last administration. But our folks formulated a policy and formulated a negotiating position that was meant to deal with the issues that presented themselves during Trump 45. Massive trade imbalance, IP issues, weaponized cyber, not friendly industrial policy. And we had a playbook. Perhaps we were not taken seriously the first time that we got into the room, but we stood by that playbook meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and we kept pushing our position until the Chinese understood clearly that we meant business. And so by staying the course with maximum pressure until we see concessions, which was the case during Trump 45, namely through the tariffs, and by staying the course with our negotiating positions, namely our clarity of red lines and sticking to settled concrete goals, we were able to bring back an agreement. And I expect that that will be the approach now. There are some added challenges, kind of changes in negotiating leverage, particularly referring to the Chinese position on critical minerals and on semiconductors. But again, by staying the course with firm negotiating positions, we will get there. Now, we've not seen a lot of concrete results out of the engagement with China thus far. And my view on that is that, and I've kind of referred to this as three-dimensional chess that the president is playing. I think that the approach that we've seen since day one of Trump 47 has been extraordinarily brilliant on this issue of global tariffs and global trade, and particularly the $1.2 billion deficit that the president inherited on day one, in that the approach has been staged. Off the bat, from the beginning of the administration, the president has very artfully leveraged the force of tariffs, many different types of tariffs that are targeted toward different countries, different geographies, different sectors. But ultimately, he's used that leverage and that strategy to pin down a large core of countries. And there are about, call it 10 countries, Japan, EU, South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, that represent around, let's call it 67% of the total trade deficit that was presented to the president on day one. And so by bringing those countries into line and settling initial agreements with them, and on top of settling the initial agreements, also using those agreements to leverage investment from those countries into our country to boost our industrial base and create jobs. In addition to that, he has fixed those variables and allowed our great negotiation teams to focus on the really big issue that's left, which is China, which comprises 20+% of that remaining 33%. Now, there are a couple of swing factors out there. India is not an easy one to nail down, still negotiating with Taiwan and a couple of others. But despite the challenge of India, the trade deficit position presented by India is not nearly as close and nearly as great as China. So in simple answer, sir, I think the answer is yes, we will get there. It will take time. It will take a smart plan and a firm plan, and it will require staying the course in negotiations.
Doesn't it strike you that the whole process we're involved in, China is so big and is a dictatorship? We're going to have to, I think, at some point, have a fairly difficult period of convincing them that there's just stuff we're not going to accept. And I think that's part of what President Trump is now going through in these negotiations. Initially, I think the Chinese thought they could shrug him off the way they had shrugged off President Biden. And I think it's been a little bit of a surprise to them how tough he's willing to be. And it's certainly been a surprise to Modi that he is imposing a 50% tariff because Modi won't quit buying Russian oil. I think that was a genuine shock and may have all sorts of consequences. But don't you think that it takes somebody as tough and as tenacious as Trump to get the attention of the Chinese dictatorship?
There's no question about it, sir. It's a very simple recipe. Sort and settle your negotiating position. Stay the course by using maximum pressure, in this case with tariffs. There is the TikTok dimension of bringing pressure, because I'm sure that the president is using the TikTok discussions to assist with the ongoing negotiation on other issues. But in addition to that, the differentiator is that the key top leadership is directly involved in the discussions. So in Trump 45, it was my secretary, Secretary Mnuchin, obviously Ambassador Lighthizer, working as a team, going through major negotiation after major negotiation. But of course, the president was directly involved with Premier Xi through phone exchanges. There were a couple of in-person meetings, and we're actually seeing the same right now. Secretary Bessent is directly involved. And as you'll be aware, the president has a call scheduled with Premier Xi on Friday. And this is the direct illustration of POTUS's personal involvement at crucial stages to ensure that the ball keeps going and to ensure that everybody at the table understands that work that's being done is being directed and engaged directly by POTUS himself.
Compared to the first term, my sense is that he's more aggressively engaged this time in terms of basically restructuring the entire global trading pattern than he was in his first term.
There's no question about that. He came out of the corner swinging. He is far more disruptive, and he's far more strategic in actions that he's taking in Washington. We could look at a bunch of different examples, but as we're talking about tariffs, I mean, let's look at 45 versus 47. The president had assumed office for the first time, had not been in the mix, as it were, of how the dynamics run in the executive and particularly in relations with the Hill. The tariffs didn't come for a little bit. I'm sure that he was getting advice that there could be challenges, and there would be challenges, and there were challenges to the use of IEEPA. And in 47, he just utilized the force of his executive authority to a point that enabled us to get where we are in delivering trade deals with countries that represent 67% of the deficit. We would not have got there, I'm quite confident, had not the president really pushed aggressively in the use of his executive authority to the fullest extent. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying, sir.
Doesn't it speak very well of Bessent and Ludnick and the trade negotiator that they've been able to handle this many different parallel negotiations almost simultaneously?
I'm a deal lawyer by nature. They had 100 negotiations going simultaneously. You couldn't find anybody. Highest levels of commerce, highest levels of Treasury, and certainly Ambassador Greer, a good friend of mine, and his great team at USTR, they were fully engaged. But look at the beauty of it, sir. Through the strategy, they were able to lock down countries that represented 2/3 of the deficit in order then to focus on the biggest fish. And that's a strategy. And the strategy worked.
It seems to me, in your book, A Seat at the Table, you really take on the critics who think that Trump's diplomacy lacks strategy. And you argue that, in fact, he has a very highly strategic approach. In fact, you describe it as a game of three-dimensional chess. I happen to agree with you. I think that Trump is far more strategic than the news media understands. But can you sort of describe for us what you mean by this game of three-dimensional chess and the way in which Trump approaches things strategically?
Well, I come back to the best example of it, which is trade. If we were to go back and look at the press coverage in the first couple of months of the administration, a good piece of that content was using the words chaos, confusion, creating damage and detriment to the U.S. economy. I don't happen to agree with that. The numbers are not in line with those descriptions, but the president used his executive authority with a specific intent, I believe, to get us where we got to today. Let's call it the 180-day point, where he had essentially wrestled down the biggest part of the issue of the deficit, while at the same time securing commitments for greater foreign investment in the U.S. to grow our industrial base and to create jobs. So on the one hand, there were commentators that were describing his approach as disruptive, as chaotic, as detrimental. But on the other hand, if we are to look at the results that the president and his team have delivered on the trade front, and we would look at the macroeconomic indicators throughout the whole of the 180, and when we have the opportunity to look at the next 30, 60, 90 days, I think that it will be very challenging for somebody to come to a view that it was anything less than strategic. It was certainly not chaotic. I'm wholly confident that there was rhyme and reason to it, that nobody was winging it, and that the desired outcome of getting us where we are today was settled at the beginning. There certainly may well have been the appearances of disruptive. There certainly may well have been the appearance of chaotic, but that is dispelled by the results that the president has delivered and his team have delivered. And so if that's not strategic, I don't know what is.
From your perspective, do you think that we will probably come out of this with terms of trade that are substantially more favorable to the United States?
We certainly have, in respect of the first round, Japan, EU, South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, a couple of others. Hard to know what will be with India. I'm confident that others that are remaining, Taiwan, Israel, and a few others, I'm confident that we will get there. The big issue, I think, is the largest elephant on the table, right, which is China. And I feel wholly confident that the team will get there. There's continuity of many of the team members from Trump 45 that went through the negotiations to begin with. Many of the core issues have not changed. It's just an issue of continuation and following on from where we had it settled in the Phase 1 trade agreement in 2020, and then also dealing with the couple of additional issues that have arisen, some of which are quite large, like rare earths and semiconductors. But I'm confident that this team will deliver, just as Trump 45 China team did deliver.
Did the Biden administration represent a pretty big detour away from the Trump focus on the American economy? Did you have a sense that all the trade negotiations that you all helped launch under Trump 1, everything just sort of fell apart under Biden?
Well, the simple point that comes to my mind, or simple word that comes to my mind, is complacency. If one thinks that inaction is going to stop predatory action by a country or countries that historically for 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, 500 years have been predatory, then that's ill-advised. I would almost want to say it's delusional. I look at some very impactful areas in which I was engaged, like infrastructure finance globally, where the United States was using very successfully with just about 20 countries in Latin America, the West End and Caribbean, and also in Asia. We were using the tools of the whole of government approach, 10 different agencies, to help our partners in those regions grow by helping them identify impactful infrastructure and energy projects that would help them grow in a healthy manner, unlike BRI, using primarily, if not exclusively, private capital sources as opposed to government funding. And all of that programming that was delivering wonderful results. We did a $3.5 billion transaction with Ecuador. We helped the Panamanians refinance their electric utility, saved them $60 million in debt service. We were working with Vietnam and completed a very large $1.2 billion LNG receiving terminal. All of that programming was scrapped, put to the side by the Biden administration in exchange for a focus on climate. And in my view, not a good use of U.S. taxpayer dollars, not good for global growth, certainly not good for the emerging market countries that we were assisting.
I mean, one of the things that's most striking to me about the transition from Obama and Biden to Trump is that he is very American-centered and that he believes that we have to really build up our economic strength. And if that makes other people a little uncomfortable, because they've been living for the last 60 years in a world in which the U.S. passively allowed them to have advantages, that's a price he's willing to pay to get back to a system which is focused on the American worker and focused on American jobs. Is that a reasonable summary of what you've been living through?
Yes, it's a great summary.
Well, but you can then understand why the other guys are all pretty irritated. I mean, it's kind of like if you had a cousin who always got to come by and borrow your car, and by the way, you put the gasoline in. And then one day he showed up and you said, I'm not going to loan it to you anymore. Suddenly he's mad at you, even though you've been the one loaning him your car. I think that's a lot of what we're seeing around the world, that the United States is now looking out for itself. But let me ask you, if you had to boil it down, what do you think is the biggest lesson American citizens should take from the past 20 years of dealing with China?
That complacency doesn't work. It's just that simple. Bottom line, like very simply, China is not converging with us. If we were to take all of its policies and look at them, how they're handling their domestic economy, how they're handling investment abroad, how they're handling engaging in the global trade system, in the global financial markets, a good part of it is undermining us. It's not converging with us. And so until one puts their foot down and says, I'm not putting up with this anymore, I'm not going to have it, this is it, then there's no chance of the less than positive behavior stopping. And under Trump 45, when we were at the table, and it was not limited to the trade negotiations, we had other engagements going on, for example, relating to unfair subsidies and export credits, where the Chinese government was using subsidies of financial subsidies to their exporters to create disadvantages against all other suppliers, including American suppliers. Under Trump 45, we proved that America does not need to blink, and that with the right leverage, whether it's tariffs, whether it's capital markets, whether it's private investment, we can make China play fair and at the same time protect our sovereignty while delivering good results for the U.S. taxpayers.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today, because you've been in the room. That's part of why your new book, A Seat at the Table, an inside account of Trump's global economic revolution. I mean, you've been there, you understand it, you help explain it. And given the scale of what we're living through, I think virtually everybody would profit from reading your new book. And I want to thank you for joining me. I do think you bring a kind of unique experience and unique wisdom in a very complicated, esoteric topic that very few Americans understand. So you're an enormous asset to all of us with the work you're doing, and I really appreciate it, Mitchell.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to repeat once again that I thank you for all the great things that you've done for your country. And finally, I'd like to thank you for today giving me a seat at the table.
Thank you to my guest, Mitchell Silk. You can get a link to buy his new book, A Seat at the Table, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.